There's a story, recorded by an early Christian writer barely a century after it supposedly happened, that a Roman emperor once had this man lowered into a vat of boiling oil in front of a crowd in Rome. According to the account, he climbed out completely unharmed. The emperor's response wasn't mercy. It was to exile him to a barren prison island instead, as if ordinary punishment simply didn't work on him. You'll understand exactly why early Christians told that story about him by the end of this video. But to get there, you have to go back to a fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee, and a young man with a temper Jesus himself gave a nickname to. His name was John, son of Zebedee, working the family fishing business alongside his older brother James. Not poor, exactly. Their father owned the boat and could afford hired men to help, but ordinary working people, nothing about them marking them out for history. Jesus called them the same way he called Peter and Andrew nearby, walking up, speaking a few words, and watching two more men leave their nets in the boat. If you'd been standing on that shore, you would have seen nothing remarkable about either of them. Just two more fishermen abandoning a perfectly good business for a traveling teacher. Here's what you don't get from most retellings of John's story. He wasn't gentle from day one. Jesus actually gave John and his brother James a nickname, Boanerges, meaning sons of thunder, not a compliment. It described two young men with a temper, quick to anger, quick to want people punished. When a Samaritan village once refused to welcome Jesus on his way through, John and James asked Jesus directly if he wanted them to call down fire from heaven to destroy the whole village. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration for effect. An actual, literal request to incinerate an entire community of people who'd simply been rude to them. Jesus said no and rebuked them for it. If you're picturing the gentle, tender figure later Christian art loves to paint John as, sit with that image for a moment instead. A young man ready to call fire down on strangers over a bruised ego. Stay with that detail, because it matters for everything that comes later. This is the same man tradition would eventually call the apostle of love, the one who wrote the sentence, God is love, into scripture. But he didn't start there. He started as someone whose first instinct, when insulted, was fire and punishment. It gets more uncomfortable. At one point, John and James, through their mother, a woman named Salome, approached Jesus with a request. When Jesus came into his kingdom, could her two sons sit on his right and left, the positions of highest honor? Not humble service, not even a subtle request. A direct ask for the best seats in the room, ahead of the other 10 disciples, who were furious when they found out. Picture that scene for a second. Jesus has just finished predicting his own suffering and death, and the response from two of his closest followers is to lobby for status. Jesus' answer was patient but firm. The ones who serve are the ones who lead, not the ones who grab the highest chair first. John, the future author of some of the gentlest words in the New Testament, spent his early years as an ambitious, fiery young man jockeying for status, exactly the kind of person you'd expect to burn out or get quietly written out of the story. And yet, somewhere in those 3 years, something shifted. John became one of only 3 disciples, alongside Peter and his own brother James, who Jesus repeatedly pulled into his innermost circle, past the other 9, into moments nobody else in the group was allowed to witness. They alone saw Jesus transfigured on a mountain, his face shining like the sun and his clothes turned dazzling white, standing and talking with Moses and Elijah as if the veil between heaven and earth had briefly come apart. John watched that happen with his own eyes and then, incredibly, went right back to arguing about status a short while later. Proof that seeing something extraordinary doesn't automatically fix what's broken in you. They alone were asked to stay closest to Jesus during his agony in Gethsemane the night before his death, though even then, John and the other 2 fell asleep instead of keeping watch. Whatever John was becoming, Jesus kept choosing to let him closer, not further away, even when he kept failing the moments that closeness demanded. At the Last Supper, John was seated close enough to Jesus that he could lean back against him directly. The gospel he later wrote describes himself only as the disciple whom Jesus loved, never naming himself outright, as if he still couldn't quite believe the title applied to him. When Jesus said one of them would betray him, panic spread around the table, and it was John who Peter signaled to across the room, asking him to lean in and quietly find out who Jesus meant. That's not incidental. Of everyone at that table, Peter, bold, loud, usually first to speak, trusted John, not himself, to ask the one question nobody else dared to ask out loud. Here's the moment that should matter most to you. When Jesus was arrested, nearly every male disciple ran. Peter followed at a distance and denied even knowing him. But John, according to his own account, was there, not hiding at a distance, not watching from a safe rooftop, not slipping away once the crowd turned hostile, standing at the foot of the cross itself while Jesus was dying, one of the only followers who didn't disappear when staying meant real danger. From the cross, in unbearable pain, Jesus looked down and saw his own mother, Mary, standing beside John. He said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to John, "Here is your mother." From that moment, John writes, he took her into his own home. Think about that for a second. In his final hour, with his own body failing, Jesus wasn't thinking only about the cosmic weight of what was happening. He was thinking about who would take care of his mother once he was gone, and he trusted that job to John. Not to a blood relative, not to the religious authorities standing nearby, but to the one disciple who'd actually stayed when it would have been so much easier to leave. Not because John had earned it through years of perfect behavior. Not because he'd stopped being ambitious or impulsive. Not because he was somehow the most obviously qualified man in the group. He was simply the one who was still standing there when it counted. After the resurrection, John ran to the empty tomb faster than Peter, arrived first, and then. This detail is almost never mentioned. Stopped and waited, letting Peter go in ahead of him. The same man who once wanted people burned for an insult now deferred to someone else at the doorway of the most important discovery in human history. That's not nothing. If you've ever wondered whether people can genuinely change, not just say they have, hold on to that image for a moment. The fastest man to the tomb, choosing to wait. Tradition and the earliest church writings hold that John went on to lead the church in Ephesus, and he's traditionally credited as the author of a gospel, 3 New Testament letters, and the book of Revelation. His gospel opens with one of the most quietly enormous sentences ever written. In the beginning was the Word. In Greek, the word used is logos, a term that carried massive philosophical weight in the ancient world, referring to divine reason, the ordering principle behind the entire universe, a concept Greek philosophers had debated for centuries before John ever picked up a pen. John took that heavyweight philosophical word and used it to describe Jesus directly in the very first line of his gospel. Somewhere between a fishing boat and old age, the Son of Thunder had become a theologian capable of writing one of the most quoted opening lines in human history. Here's where that boiling oil story comes back in. The early church writer Tertullian, writing around the turn of the 3rd century, recorded a tradition that Roman authorities in the city itself threw John into a vat of boiling oil, and that he emerged from it completely unharmed. Shortly after, according to the same tradition, he was exiled to the island of Patmos, a rocky, isolated place used by Rome to banish troublemakers, cut off from ships and news and everyone he'd ever built a church alongside. We can't verify every detail of that account with certainty, but it was on that island, alone, that John reportedly received and wrote down the visions that became the book of Revelation, full of thunder and fire and judgment and cosmic battle. The Son of Thunder, it turns out, never fully lost his thunder. He just learned, eventually, what it was actually for. Later, likely after returning from exile, John also wrote several letters to the churches he'd shepherded, and in them he confronted a real threat. Early teachers claiming Jesus hadn't truly come in a physical body at all, a belief historians now call an early form of Gnosticism. John's response wasn't gentle theological hedging. He wrote bluntly that anyone denying Jesus had come in the flesh was speaking with the spirit of an antichrist. The same directness that once wanted a village burned down was now aimed at defending the truth of who Jesus actually was. Thunder repurposed into something worth fighting for. And here's the detail that separates John from every other apostle in this series. According to the strongest early traditions, John was the only one of the 12 who wasn't martyred. Peter was crucified. Most of the others died violently for their faith. John, after surviving an attempt on his life and years of exile, is believed to have lived to old age and died naturally, likely back in Ephesus, decades after everyone he started with was gone. That's the answer to the question we opened with, not immortality. Just a life that outlasted the fire it started with. Proof, if you needed it, that surviving your own worst instincts is sometimes the quieter miracle. 3 things are worth carrying with you from John's story. First, the temper you're ashamed of today isn't necessarily your final chapter. John spent years as one half of the Sons of Thunder, and he's remembered instead as the apostle of love. Second, staying is its own kind of courage. John isn't remembered for a single dramatic act of heroism, but for simply refusing to leave the foot of the cross when almost everyone else had already run. And that kind of quiet endurance rarely feels like courage while you're living it. Third, the deepest transformation often isn't dramatic. It's a young man who once demanded the best seat in the kingdom slowly learning, one small moment at a time, to let someone else walk through the doorway first. The fisherman who once asked to burn a village down spent his final years writing, again and again, in different words, that God is love. And if you're waiting for proof that people can actually change, it's hard to find a clearer one than that.